The two sons of Prince Mark of Beauvau, who had made a very brilliant commencement in his campaign, were now following the retreat. The elder lieutenant of Carbineers was seriously wounded, having had his thigh broken with a lance wound in the affair at Vinkovo. He owed his life to the emperor, for Napoleon had him placed in one of his carriages, recommending him specifically to the Grand Equerry, Caulaincourt, and frequently asked with interest for news of him during the retreat. The emperor held the parents of the young Beauvaus in high esteem, and these on their side never forgot the kindness which they had received from him. Prince de Beauvau was one of the chamberlains who had been most in attendance on Napoleon's return from the island of Elba. Monsieur de Beauvau resumed the functions of his post and sat in the imperial chamber of peers. Princess de Beauvau was a lady-in-waiting in the empress's palace. The emperor had a particular regard for this lady and thought to give her a striking proof of this regard, as I mentioned in its place at the time of the formation of the Empress Marie-Louise's household. The emperor's firmness and resolution grew in proportion with the dangers of the critical position in which he found himself placed. At Dubrovna, a singular alarm spread round the bivouac. Dawn was beginning to break when the camp was thrown into a state of tumult. At the first sounds thereof, I made haste to dress and hurry to the house where the emperor had passed the night, near which I was lodged. I met Count de Rue under way, also going there and fully as anxious as I was. We found Napoleon half-dressed on the threshold, giving orders that the Cossacks, who no doubt had caused this scrimmage, should be driven off. But it was not an attack by the enemy which had caused all this confusion. It was the loud cries of calling somebody whose name was Ozan. This name, repeated from bivouac to bivouac, had given rise to the belief that a call, "Aux armes," was being made. Such an alarm might any day entail serious dangers in the state of disorder inseparable from the disorganization of the army corps, and in view of the fact that the camp was very carelessly guarded. Napoleon rode through the camp, ordering the guards and the troops to redouble in vigilance and to charge themselves with the care of seeing that a supervision and a discipline which had become more than ever necessary were maintained. This circumstance, the remembrance of the alert at Gardena and similar dangers to which he saw himself exposed, the anxiety which he felt at the time as to what had become of Marshal Ney, of whom we had no news, filled the emperor with grave and sad reflections. In 1805, after Austerlitz, the respect of a marshal of France for a king's word of honor, given with but little scruple, had preserved Alexander from the misfortune of falling into the hands of a detachment of French troops. But Napoleon had seen that this prince had retained no friendly recollection of the tacit approval which he had given to Marshal Davout's conduct on this occasion. The emperor knew that the Tsar was today dominated by the more than hostile influence of his enemies, from whose fury he might expect anything. Napoleon could not bear the idea of having to serve, in case of misfortune, to adorn the triumph of these implacable adversaries. He asked his ordinary medical advisor, Dr. Ivan, in consequence, to give him a dose of poison, which was contained in a sachet, which he could carry round his neck, and which was to spare him the humiliation of falling alive into the hands of the Cossacks and of being exposed to the insults of these savages. The army found some stores, 40 cannon and 2 pontoon trains at Orcha. The 2 heavy pontoon trains were sacrificed, a sacrifice which later on was to be very fatal to the issue of our retreat, because they would have stuck in the broken down roads, and in order to employ the few horses that remained for artillery trains, to leave as little as possible to serve as trophies to the enemy, Napoleon ordered almost all his carriages, his luggage, and the secret papers contained in the portfolio, which was in my hands, to be burned. It was from this portfolio that I derived the title of Secretary to the Portfolio. with which the emperor had invested me. The cavalry being entirely on foot, there was spontaneously formed a squadron of from 500 to 600 men composed of officers who still had a horse each to watch over Napoleon's person. The officers formed the privates of this squadron. The non-commissioned officers were colonels and the officers, generals. This squadron later on took the name of the Cursed Battalion because those who composed it lost their horses one after the other. It was commanded by General Grouchy under the orders of the King of Naples, Murat. The emperor, having fully informed himself which was the best road to take, decided to march rapidly from Orsha to Borsov, hoping to reach the Berezina before the enemy who were maneuvering to close the road of Vilna against us. Admiral Chichikov, commanding the army of Moldavia, who, by a treaty of neutrality concluded with the Russians by the Austrian general, Prince Schwarzenberg, enjoyed full liberty of action, had marched to this river. He had crossed it at first, but having been driven back by Marshal Oudinot, had recrossed it and had destroyed the bridge. Napoleon and the French troops then found themselves in a more dangerous position. The emperor had with him less than 40,000 men, including the corps of Belun and Reggio, surrounded by more than 100,000 Russians supplied with everything, fighting on their own native ground, whilst half our soldiers were exhausted by the cold and by horrible fatigues, being moreover mentally depressed by so many reverses and the great distance which separated them from their fatherland. The imminence of the danger, far from weakening Napoleon's energy, tempered all the valor of his vigorous mind and indefatigable genius. Having succeeded in duping the enemy by feint maneuvers, he succeeded in crossing the Berezina beyond Borsov. The change to mild weather, which under all other circumstances would have been a blessing to our soldiers, brought on the contrary fresh misfortunes upon us. For the solid ice would have served us as a bridge, whereas the thaw, having broken up the ice, the Berezina drifted innumerable ice floes. In order to construct trestle bridges, our brave sappers and pontiniers, under the command of General Eblay, were frequently forced to plunge into the icy water up to their shoulders, hampered in their movements and often wounded by the ice floes, which were dragged along by the current. In spite of so much suffering, so many obstacles, these brave fellows constructed several bridges rapidly and with admirable devotion, over which the remnants of our unhappy army crossed the river in turn in an order which had been commanded by the emperor, who superintended the operation in person. The bridges broke down several times, a circumstance which aggravated the fatigues of our brave pontoniers, who were forced to repair the damage and begin their work over again. In spite of Napoleon's exhortations and repeated commands sent over the water that the opposite bank should be evacuated, there remained behind some thousands of laggards and non-combatants who could not make up their minds to abandon their innumerable carriages of every kind and their baggage. They only could make up their minds to do so when the enemy's cannon began to scatter dismay and death in the midst of this frantic mob. The confusion then became inexpressibly horrible, and the breaking down of the bridges, which gave way beneath the weight of these unhappy men, left all those who had not been able to cross the river in the power of the Russians. It would be a task beyond my power to describe the misfortunes of this day, so deplorable under one aspect, and yet at the same time so full of glory for the bravery of our army. It is in the midst of great dangers that the character of the French soldier reveals itself. Never did he show himself so great as in this catastrophe, emulating his chiefs in heroism. Napoleon's presence of mind and indefatigable activity as he multiplied himself, taking every measure, keeping his eye on everything, is the best answer that can be made to those who have insinuated that on this memorable occasion he was afflicted with absolute mental and physical prostration. Never, on the contrary, did he display greater strength of mind, nor exercise more genius than in these terrible moments. So also will he be found in the midst of the grave events of the campaigns of Saxony and of France. All justice must be rendered to Marshal Ney for his bravery and admirable firmness. This marshal was the hero of the retreat. What devotion and presence of mind in the midst of danger, what familiarity with war and courage can produce of miracles, was realized by this intrepid warrior who, turn by turn, was general and common soldier. How was it that the remembrance of his heroic conduct, of the 1,000 civic crowns and laurel wreaths which adorned his brows, did not preserve him from the thunderbolt that struck him down? It was no longer possible to preserve even the shadow of discipline, and each man left to himself tried to reach Vilna as best he could. At last, having reached Molodechno, the emperor found there a great quantity of dispatches which had been brought by estafettes, who had not been able to reach him till then. These letters contained particulars of the Malay attempt, the news of which he had first heard of on the evening before his arrival at Smolensk. Public security had not till then been troubled in Paris by the announcement of any disaster, but the distance by which the chief and the army were remote, the savagery of the Russians' means of defense, and the burning of Moscow created a vague feeling of anxiety in France. Suddenly, the foolhardy enterprise of Malay broke out, the audacity of which stupefied Paris and the authorities. The desultory nature of the measures which were taken to oppose it show a state of uncertainty which might have proved fatal if the agents of the conspiracy had been on better understanding. The Empress was living very quietly with her son at St. Cloud when she was suddenly alarmed as to her son's safety and her own by the appearance of a detachment of guards sent on by the Minister of War, which galloped into the palace courtyard in great precipitation. She at once ran out in a dressing gown with her hair flying out behind onto a balcony which overlooked the courtyard, and it was there she received the first news of an attempt which she had little expected. Her consternation did not, however, last a long time. But what produced a profound impression in France and in Europe was the audacity with which an obscure man, without money or credit alone, and without accomplices, had escaped from prison to try a coup de main, which had very nearly succeeded. Other reasons for amazement were the facility with which he had succeeded in persuading the troops that the emperor was dead, and that consequently the empire was at an end. The passive submission of the municipal authorities to his behests, and finally the way in which the King of Rome and his mother had been forgotten. The project of profiting by Napoleon's absence when engaged in some distant expedition with a view of overthrowing the empire was a fixed idea which had long been growing in the head of Malay, that monomaniac of conspiracy. In 1806, after the Battle of Eylau, and in 1809, after the Battle of Essling, Malay, counting on the serious embarrassments which would keep Napoleon away from France, had tried to make use of the same means for provoking an upheaval. The first indications accused him of participation in these revolutionary intrigues, but convicting documents being wanting for the definite establishment of his complicity, Malay was not sent for a trial. A decree ordered his detention only in one of the state prisons. In 1809, the police were informed that Malay had organized a plan of insurrection in the forced prison, which was to break out on a Sunday, on the day fixed for the chanting of a Te Deum at Notre Dame in honor of the entry of the French troops into Vienna. The indulgence with which he was treated having encouraged him, Malay thought that the misfortunes of the retreat from Moscow at last offered him an opportunity of realizing the design, the execution of which he was pursuing with such constant obstinacy. Seeing the necessity of his presence in Paris, the emperor, who had not wished to separate himself from the army as long as it was being menaced by imminent dangers, at last made up his mind to start for France. Dressed in a fur-lined pelisse, a present from the Emperor Alexander in happier days, and wearing an astrachan cap on his head, Napoleon, during the retreat, had most often walked on foot with a stick in his hand, taking the arm of the King of Naples or one of his marshals in the midst of his troops and escorted by the sacred or cursed battalion. He only very rarely got into his carriage or mounted on horseback. On December 5th, on the day of his arrival at Smorgoni, the emperor assembled the leaders of his army and informed them of his departure, provided for all things with detailed instructions, and left the supreme command to his brother-in-law, Murat, with Prince de Neuchâtel as his major general. On December 2nd, he had sent Colonel Anatole de Montesquieu onto Paris, charged with the mission of publishing good news along the way in towns as well as simple villages so as to reassure Poland, Germany, and France, who must have been rendered anxious by the absence of all reports from the army. Napoleon sent the 29th bulletin on ahead of him, and in this bulletin he concealed none of our disasters. He left on December 5th with the Duc de Vissons, Caulaincourt, and a sledge with no other escort than his Mameluke, Rustem, and one groom, Count Vontsovich, who was seated on the box of the sledge, acted as interpreter. Napoleon made his way to Warsaw, where he found fresh reasons for displeasure with Abbe de Prat, and thence proceeded to Dresden, where were his ambassador Serra and the King of Saxony. He continued his way by Erfurt and Mayence, halting at Erfurt to send letters to his envoys at the courts of the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine, and orders to the generals in command of our military forces in Germany. He then proceeded from Mayence to Paris without stopping on the way. The emperor arrived very late in the evening of December 18th at the Tuileries. The empress, who was sad and unwell, had just gone to bed, for Napoleon had given her no notice of his approaching arrival. Frightened by the noises which she heard in the drawing room, which opened out of her bedroom, Marie-Louise was rising to find out what was going on when she saw the emperor enter, rush up to her and clasp her in his arms. The noise outside, which had rather frightened the empress, was caused by a discussion between two men hooded and wrapped in fur cloaks, with the lady-in-waiting who slept in the adjoining room of the empress's bedroom. This lady, as was her bounden duty, was defending the entrance to the bedroom when one of these men, throwing open his mantle, disclosed the emperor to her stupefied gaze. Napoleon saw the soil of his country again as greater perhaps than when he had left it. More than once had his audacious and skillful maneuvers and the ascendancy of his genius saved the remains of the French army from a destruction which appeared inevitable. Adversity had found him strong and even immovable. Adversity had awakened in him that vigor of mind and those qualities which that hard school develops in chosen natures. Fortune, then, in betraying, had not diminished him, but she had weakened his prestige of invincibility. The army had lost none of its glorious reputation. It had displayed in these evil days an intrepidity, a constancy, and warlike virtues which have amazed the world. It was only beaten by the elements, and if the bodies of the soldiers succumbed, their hearts never failed. The leaders of this valiant army had shown themselves worthy of it. Attacked by every disaster, reduced to a handful of soldiers with barely enough strength to carry their arms, the army had still imposed respect on the enemy. No doubt that among so many brave soldiers there were numerous exceptions, as must necessarily be the case in any large agglomeration of men exposed to the direct calamities, for all characters are not tempered alike. But why make mention of such exceptions when the bulk showed such endurance and such courage? Those whose names might be mentioned as having been exceptions to the rule were, for the most part, men who had no need of the test of adversity to show their imperfections, their weaknesses, or their vices. The 29th bulletin, which had preceded the emperor to Paris, where it was delivered 36 hours before his arrival, had explained the long silence of the great army and had thrown a sad light on the disasters of the retreat. The minds of men were struck with these sinister pictures, and comparisons were instituted between the expedition of Cambyses to Egypt and the retreat from Moscow. Some thick-headed people applied to Napoleon a passage sufficiently striking, it is true, out of the Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness and Decline of the Romans, chapter 17, where Montesquieu, after having spoken of the invasions of the barbarians into Europe, emboldened as they were by the enfeeblement of Charlemagne's empire, adds, "If a prince were to create such ravages in Europe today, the nations driven back in the north to the limits of the universe would keep their stand there until the moment when they would inundate Europe for the third time."